Before America became a superpower, before the stars and stripes flew across the world, this land had already endured tens of thousands of years of upheaval. A place where civilizations rose and vanished, where dreams of freedom were written in blood, sweat, and sacrifice, from ancient tribes and ships crossing vast oceans, through wars of independence and a devastating civil conflict, to global confrontations and modern crises. The history of the United States is not a simple story of victory. It is an ongoing journey of self-definition. In this video, we follow the traces of America through each era to understand how land once unknown on the margins of the world came to shape the fate of humanity. Before the United States existed, before the name America appeared on any map, there were cities larger than London, communities more populous than many medieval European kingdoms, and a history stretching back tens of thousands of years, yet leaving behind almost no written words. Their history was not recorded in ink but in earth and stone, in bones and in traces buried by time. Because of this, their story was misunderstood, simplified, or forgotten for centuries. This is the story of the Americas before 1492, when history had not yet been named and humanity still lived in rhythm with the breath of the land. Long before European sails crossed the Atlantic, long before borders were drawn and power defined, North America was already a continent of people, memory, and deep history. Around 20,000 years ago, during the harsh cold of the Ice Age, sea levels dropped more than 100 meters below today's levels, exposing a vast land bridge where the Bering Strait now lies, connecting Siberia and Alaska. This was not a chosen route or a deliberate expedition of conquest, but a journey of survival. Groups of hunter-gatherers from East Asia followed migrating herds across the frozen land, unaware that each step was opening an entirely new chapter in human history. They arrived not in a single generation but over thousands of years, in small groups and families, slowly spreading southward, eastward, and westward, until humans inhabited the entire American continent, from dense forests to open plains, from high mountains to distant coastlines. Modern science confirms this through indigenous DNA, stone tools buried deep in the earth, and archaeological sites dating back as far as 15,000 years. The Americas were never an empty land. They had people, history, and memory long before Europeans gave them a name. When the first humans reached North America, they entered a world vastly different from today, a continent of giant creatures, mammoths, ancient bison, massive ground sloths. Humans lived as true hunters, moving constantly with the seasons, the herds, and the rhythms of nature. This era, known as the Paleo-Indian period, lasted roughly from 15,000 to 8,000 BCE. They built no cities, practiced no agriculture, and stored little surplus, yet their survival skills were extraordinary. Finely crafted Clovis spear points found across North America reveal not primitive societies, but communities with advanced technical knowledge and remarkable adaptability. But nature did not stand still. As the ice melted and the climate warmed, the megafauna disappeared. The old world collapsed, forcing humans to change or vanish with it. Around 8000 BCE, the Archaic period began. People no longer depended solely on large game but diversified into hunting smaller animals, fishing, gathering, and gradually shaping their environment. Seasonal settlements appeared along rivers, and for the first time in the Americas, people began to plant crops. These early seeds, humble and experimental, quietly transformed the future of the continent. Stability led to accumulation, and accumulation to more complex societies. Around 1000 BCE, the woodland period emerged. Pottery, ceremonial structures, and expanded agriculture appeared. Massive earthen mounds were constructed not as homes, but as sacred spaces, burial grounds, and symbols of communal identity. In the Ohio River Valley, the Adena and later the Hopewell cultures developed. Remarkably, they were not isolated. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and volcanic stone from the Rockies reveal a vast trade network spanning thousands of kilometers, through which goods, beliefs, and ideas flowed across North America. Around the year 1000 CE, something unprecedented arose in the heart of the continent. A city emerged from the earth, Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis. This was the pinnacle of Mississippian culture. A large-scale agricultural society with earthen pyramids over 30 meters high, vast plazas, and a population estimated between 20 and 40,000 people. At its peak, Cahokia was larger than London. It had no stone architecture, no written language, yet possessed a stratified social order, theocratic leadership, and a complex food distribution system. Then, like many civilizations before it, Cahokia declined. The exact cause remains unknown: climate change, resource depletion, or internal conflict. By the time Europeans arrived, the city had been reclaimed by forest and soil, leaving only silent mounds on the plain. Before 1492, the Americas were not sparsely populated. Scholars estimate that 50 to 60 million people lived across the continent, with 10 to 15 million in North America alone, and perhaps 5 to 10 million within what is now the United States. They had villages, cities, political alliances, religions, art, and long histories. All of this was about to encounter a fateful turning point, driven not only by swords and guns, but by microbes, disease, and the collision of worlds. When Christopher Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, he did not discover an empty land. He stepped onto the remnants of an ancient world that had existed for tens of thousands of years. The pre-Columbian era is not a faint prologue to U.S. history, but its deepest foundation, the soil from which all later stories grow. And if one listens closely, beneath layers of earth and stone, that history still whispers, waiting to be told again. Long after indigenous civilizations had taken root in American soil, a quiet yet global transformation unfolded across the ocean. Europe entered the age of exploration, driven by ambition, gold, power, and religious zeal. From that moment, the history of the Americas entered an entirely new era, later called the Age of Exploration and Colonization. In 1492, Columbus sailed under the Spanish flag. He did not land on what is now the United States, but his voyage opened the door for European expansion into the Western Hemisphere. In European eyes, the Americas were not a world with history, but a new land to be claimed, exploited, and converted. Spain, Portugal, France, and England soon competed fiercely for territory, resources, and influence. During the 16th century, Spain dominated early exploration of North America, venturing into Florida, the Southwest, and the Pacific coast. Explorers like Hernando de Soto and Francisco Vázquez de Coronado pushed inland with horses, steel, firearms, and diseases unknown to indigenous populations. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread faster than any army, reducing native populations by as much as 90% in some regions within a few generations. France followed a different path, focusing on the fur trade, river exploration, and alliances with native tribes. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, establishing New France. Rather than mass settlement, the French relied on trade networks and alliances with Algonquin and Huron peoples, creating colonies centered on commerce rather than large-scale land seizure. The English, by contrast, came to settle. In 1607, Jamestown was founded in Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Its early years were marked by famine, disease, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. Only through tobacco cultivation and indigenous assistance did it survive. Tobacco soon became the economic foundation of the southern colonies and paved the way for a lasting tragedy: slavery. In 1619, the first Africans were brought to Virginia, marking the beginning of African slavery in English America. Initially ambiguous in legal status, slavery became fully institutionalized over time, especially in the South. From this point on, American history would be shaped by a profound contradiction: freedom and oppression existing side by side. In 1620, another ship arrived, carrying very different passengers. The Mayflower brought Puritans fleeing religious persecution, seeking not wealth but a place to build a godly society. Plymouth Colony emerged from this vision, and New England developed a social model centered on community, education, and family labor rather than plantation slavery. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, 13 English colonies formed along the Atlantic coast. From Massachusetts to Georgia, each differed economically and culturally. yet all remained under British rule. They were taxed without representation, regulated by mercantilist policies, and gradually grew resentful. As Europeans expanded, native peoples were pushed from ancestral lands through broken treaties and warfare, leaving wounds that would last for centuries. By the mid-18th century, the colonies had a population of about 2.5 million. With vibrant economies, local political institutions, schools, and newspapers, colonists no longer saw themselves merely as British subjects, but as distinct communities with their own identity. The seeds of independence were taking root. Thus, the colonial era was not merely about exploration and flags, but about the collision of indigenous, European, and African worlds, forming the conflicted foundation of the future United States. When these tensions could no longer be contained, history moved toward an inevitable confrontation. As the 18th century drew to a close, the surface of colonial life appeared calm, but beneath it pressure had been building for generations. Britain, burdened by war debt after the French and Indian War, imposed new taxes. The colonists resisted, crystallizing their anger in the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Events escalated. The Boston Massacre in 1770, the Boston Tea Party in 1773, and the Punitive Coercive Acts. In 1774, the First Continental Congress convened. War followed in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord. The early years were harsh. The colonies lacked a professional army and faced the world's greatest military power. Yet they possessed a cause: self-government. George Washington led the Continental Army through hunger, cold, and defeat. Meanwhile, on July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence proclaimed a radical idea: power derives from the people, and all men are endowed with inalienable rights. After the pivotal victory at Saratoga in 1777, France allied with the Americans. In 1781, British forces surrendered at Yorktown. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized American independence. Victory, however, raised deeper questions: how to govern, who truly enjoyed liberty, and how ideals would meet reality. The years after independence were fragile. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government was weak, unable to tax or maintain order. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 exposed the system's failure. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia, not to revise but to rebuild. The result was the U.S. Constitution, a revolutionary framework of popular sovereignty, separation of powers, and checks and balances. Ratified in 1788, with George Washington inaugurated in 1789, the new government established courts, departments, and a financial system under Alexander Hamilton. To ease fears of centralized power, the Bill of Rights was adopted in 1791, guaranteeing fundamental freedoms. Political parties soon emerged, and America began defining itself both internally and on the world stage. Territorial expansion followed. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the nation's size. The War of 1812 tested independence once more. By 1820, the United States was no longer a fragile experiment, but a growing nation, though riven with unresolved tensions between freedom and slavery, federal and state power. From 1820 to 1860, expansion westward accelerated under the belief in manifest destiny. Opportunity and violence moved together. Indigenous peoples were forcibly removed under the Indian Removal Act of 1830, culminating in the Trail of Tears. Meanwhile, each new territory reignited the slavery debate. Compromises delayed conflict but did not resolve it. The annexation of Texas and the Mexican-American War added vast lands, intensifying the crisis. Kansas descended into bloodshed. Abolitionist movements grew, while decisions like Dred Scott deepened division. By the late 1850s, the nation was stretched to its breaking point. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 became the final spark. Thus, the era of expansion was one of triumph in territory but fracture in spirit. The United States grew larger, yet divided within its soul. When compromise collapsed, the nation faced its greatest trial, a war not for independence or land, but to decide whether the United States was truly one nation, and what the cost of that answer would be. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. As the year 1861 began, the United States was no longer a nation debating its future, but a nation standing on the edge of disintegration. The contradictions that had accumulated over many decades could no longer be contained. The question was no longer compromise, but survival. After the election of 1860, 7 Southern states declared their secession from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, believing they were defending self-determination and their social order, while the North viewed this act as a betrayal of the Republic and a direct threat to the nation's existence. The war erupted in April 1861 when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Few lives were lost in that first engagement, but it marked the complete end of any path toward reconciliation. Both sides entered the conflict with different calculations. The South believed it was fighting to defend its homeland and the sovereignty of its states, while the North believed it was fighting to preserve the Union and the constitutional order. At the outset, Abraham Lincoln did not declare war to abolish slavery. His immediate objective was to prevent the Union from collapsing. The early months of the war quickly shattered all illusions of a short conflict. Battles such as Bull Run revealed that both sides lacked experience and that the cost would be enormous. The North held advantages in population, industry, and railroads, while the South possessed talented generals and the defensive advantage of fighting on familiar territory. As the war dragged on, America's fields, towns, and rivers were transformed into battlefields. As casualties mounted and the war lengthened, the purpose of the conflict began to change. Abraham Lincoln gradually recognized that the Union could not endure if slavery remained intact. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring the freedom of enslaved people in the rebelling states. This document did not immediately abolish slavery nationwide, but it transformed the Civil War into a war for freedom and allowed African Americans to join the Union Army. Hundreds of thousands of people who had once been enslaved now took up arms to fight for a future that had never before been promised to them. The war entered an even more brutal phase. Battles such as Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg produced casualty figures unprecedented in American history. Gettysburg in 1863 became a decisive turning point when Union forces halted the Confederate invasion of the North, after which the balance of the war gradually shifted. The victory at Vicksburg gave the Union control of the entire Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two and choking its supply lines. In the South, the war was fought not only on the battlefield but also in daily life. The plantation economy was devastated, inflation soared, and civilians endured severe hardship. The North, though suffering heavy losses, maintained industrial production and strategic supply. The strategy of total war, implemented by generals such as Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, targeted infrastructure and civilian morale. Sherman's march from Atlanta to the sea, which destroyed railroads, warehouses, and supplies, demonstrated that the war was no longer merely about defeating enemy armies, but about breaking an entire society's capacity to continue fighting. By 1865, the South was exhausted militarily, economically, and psychologically. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, marking the effective collapse of the Confederacy. The American Civil War ended after 4 years, leaving the nation shattered. More than 620,000 soldiers had died, more than the total number of Americans killed in all other wars combined up to the 20th century. The Union victory preserved the United States as a unified nation and legally ended slavery with the 13th Amendment. But the cost was immense. Families were torn apart, cities lay in ruins, and deep psychological scars haunted generations. The Civil War not only determined that the Union would not be divided, but also redefined the meaning of freedom and citizenship in the United States. As the war ended, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated just days later, a tragedy that closed the bloodiest chapter in American history. The United States emerged from the Civil War not as a nation wholly triumphant, but as a society in need of healing and reconstruction. From the ashes, America entered its next phase, a period filled with hope and controversy, where the question was no longer whether the Union would survive, but how it would survive, and who would truly be recognized as citizens. Industrialization and the rise to great power status, 1865 to 1914. As the smoke of the Civil War slowly cleared, the United States entered a period of rebirth and profound transformation. The nation was no longer the young agrarian federation of the early 19th century, but was preparing to become an industrial power at a pace unprecedented in human history. The period from 1865 to 1914 is often called the era of industrialization or the Gilded Age. An age of steel, coal, railroads, and immense wealth, but also one of inequality, labor conflict, and deep social change. After the Civil War, the South entered the era of Reconstruction, while the North and Midwest accelerated industrial growth. Factories rose around new urban centers such as Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Cleveland. Steel became the backbone of the economy. Coal-fueled machinery and railroads linked regions together. In 1869, the first transcontinental railroad was completed, connecting the East Coast to the West and transforming the United States into a unified market where goods, people, and ideas could move at unprecedented speed. This industrial boom was inseparable from massive waves of immigration from Europe. Tens of millions of Irish, German, Italian, Eastern European, and Jewish immigrants crossed the Atlantic seeking opportunity and escape from poverty, war, and persecution. They became the core labor force in factories, mines, and construction sites. American cities expanded rapidly, urban populations surged, and crowded tenements, poor living conditions, and stark social stratification became defining features of urban life. In this environment, powerful industrial magnates emerged with enormous economic influence. Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, and J.P. Morgan in finance built massive corporations that dominated markets. They generated extraordinary growth but also provoked fears of monopolies and the corruption of democracy. The era was called Gilded because a thin layer of prosperity concealed deep social injustice beneath. Rapid industrial growth brought intense labor conflict. Workers labored under dangerous conditions, long hours, and low wages. Major strikes erupted, such as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Homestead Strike of 1892, revealing open confrontation between labor and capital. For the first time in U.S. history, the federal government often sided with business interests, deploying troops or security forces to suppress labor movements, exposing the limits of economic freedom without social protection. While industrialization transformed urban life, the American West witnessed the completion of continental expansion. Wars with Native American tribes ended with their forced relocation to reservations. The massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 is often seen as the symbolic end of the Indian Wars and the close of an era. U.S. territory was now largely fixed from the Atlantic to the Pacific. As economic power grew, the United States began to look outward. In 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out and ended quickly, transforming the United States into an overseas imperial power with territories such as Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. This marked a turning point in foreign policy, as the nation assumed an imperial role for the first time, sparking domestic debate over whether such expansion aligned with its founding ideals. At the dawn of the 20th century, reactions to social injustice and corporate power coalesced into the progressive movement. Investigative journalists, social reformers, and politicians pushed for antitrust laws, improved labor conditions, consumer protection, and expanded democracy. The federal government began to intervene more actively in the economy, signaling a fundamental shift in the role of the state in an industrial society. By 1914, as Europe descended into World War I, the United States had become the world's largest economy. With rising industrial, financial, and military power, in less than half a century, a nation devastated by civil war had transformed itself into a global power. Yet this rise was built not only on technological progress and economic growth, but also on sacrifice, conflict, and unresolved questions of social justice. The era of industrialization was therefore not merely a story of machines and factories, but a period in which the United States forged a new national identity. Dynamic and full of potential, yet deeply contradictory. Those contradictions would accompany America into the 20th century. where its role on the world stage would be tested in ways never before imagined. World Wars and the Great Depression, 1914 to 1945. As 1914 dawned, the United States faced a world sliding toward chaos, yet remained distant from the upheaval in Europe. The war across the Atlantic initially appeared to Americans as a distant tragedy of old empires. President Woodrow Wilson declared neutrality, hoping to keep the nation out of violence. But in a world increasingly bound by trade, finance, and technology, war could not be kept at bay by intention alone. As World War I dragged on and escalated, American economic and security interests became increasingly entangled. German submarine attacks on merchant shipping disrupted trade, and the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which killed hundreds including American citizens, undermined neutrality. In 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Zimmermann telegram inviting Mexico to attack the United States was exposed. The United States entered the war not only for strategic interests, but with the belief that the global order itself required reshaping. American participation altered the course of the war. Millions of U.S. soldiers were sent to Europe. Vast industrial resources were mobilized, and within just over a year, the balance of power tipped decisively in favor of the Allies. When the war ended in 1918, the United States emerged as a new world power with a decisive role in victory. Paradoxically, the nation soon retreated into isolationism. The Senate rejected membership in the League of Nations, and the country withdrew from deep international commitments to focus inward. The 1920s opened with an image of prosperity and optimism. Industry expanded rapidly. Automobiles, cinema, radio, and mass consumer goods reshaped modern life. The stock market soared, and belief spread that prosperity would last indefinitely. Beneath this optimism, however, lay fragile foundations: overproduction, rising debt, and an unregulated financial system. In October 1929, the bubble burst. The stock market collapsed, triggering a chain reaction of bank failures, business closures, and mass unemployment. The Great Depression spread across the nation, with unemployment reaching roughly a quarter of the workforce. Millions of families lost homes and livelihoods, and faith in the free market system was shaken to its core. America faced not only a material crisis, but a profound moral and psychological one. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt assumed the presidency with a radically new approach to government. Through the New Deal, the federal government intervened directly in the economy, creating jobs, stabilizing banks, protecting workers, and assisting the poor. This marked a historic turning point in which the state became a guarantor of social welfare and economic stability on an unprecedented scale. Although the New Deal did not fully end the Depression, it permanently transformed the relationship between government and American citizens. As the United States struggled to recover, the world moved once again toward war. Fascism rose in Europe, militarism in Asia, and global threats intensified. The United States initially avoided direct involvement, but on December 7, 1941, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor erased any remaining distance. America entered World War II not as a hesitant power, but as a nation compelled to act in self-defense. World War II transformed the United States more profoundly than any previous event. The economy was fully mobilized. Factories produced weapons, ships, and aircraft at massive scale. Unemployment virtually disappeared, and women and minorities entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The United States became the arsenal of democracy, fighting on two fronts in Europe and the Pacific with an increasingly central role. By 1945, the war ended with the complete defeat of the Axis powers. The United States and its allies emerged victorious, but at immense cost. The most controversial moment came with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to Japan's surrender and ushering in the nuclear age, along with ethical questions that remain unresolved. As World War II concluded, the United States had not only won a war, but risen to the center of a new global order. With the strongest economy, the largest military, and worldwide political influence, a nation once reluctant to embrace international leadership now became a superpower with unprecedented responsibility and power. From this moment, American history entered a new chapter, a prolonged era of tension in which peace and annihilation coexisted in the fragile balance of the Cold War. The Cold War era, 1945 to 1991. As the guns of World War II fell silent, a new order quickly emerged. This time, the enemy was not found on visible battlefields, but in opposing ideologies. The United States emerged from 1945 with overwhelming economic, military, and technological power, yet faced a rising rival in the Soviet Union, a power forged in wartime devastation and committed to a fundamentally different social model. The world was divided not simply by national borders, but by an invisible line of belief, power, and nuclear fear. In the early post-war years, the United States asserted leadership by establishing global institutions such as the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, and by launching the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. These efforts aimed not only at economic recovery, but at containing the spread of communism. Containment became the guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy and led to the formation of military alliances such as NATO in 1949, laying the foundations of a bipolar world. Domestically, the post-war period saw unprecedented economic growth. The middle class expanded, suburbs flourished, and the American dream was promoted as a model opposed to socialist societies. Alongside prosperity came fear of ideological infiltration. The anti-communist crusade led by Senator Joseph McCarthy created a climate of suspicion, in which artists, scientists, and civil servants were investigated and punished on mere suspicion of disloyalty. The Cold War thus penetrated not only distant borders, but the inner lives of Americans. Internationally, conflict between the superpowers rarely took the form of direct confrontation, instead erupting through proxy wars. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 marked the first large-scale U.S. military intervention to contain communism in Asia. The war ended in stalemate and division of the Korean Peninsula, demonstrating that the Cold War could become violently real. Meanwhile, the arms race and space race pushed the world to the brink of destruction. Nuclear weapons and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction ensured that any direct confrontation could end civilization itself. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 marked the most dangerous moment. When the world stood on the edge of nuclear war, one miscalculation away from catastrophe, the crisis revealed both the power and the limits of ideological confrontation. As both sides ultimately stepped back. At home, the 1950s and 1960s were not only a period of external rivalry, but of internal reckoning. The civil rights movement challenged entrenched racial discrimination and forced federal intervention through landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. While the United States presented itself as a global defender of freedom, Americans were compelled to confront the unfinished work of freedom within their own society. The most divisive conflict of this era was the Vietnam War. Initially justified as part of containment, it became a political and moral wound. Millions of American soldiers were deployed, tens of thousands died, and society fractured under anti-war movements. Public trust in government collapsed following revelations such as the Pentagon Papers. The war ended in 1975 with U.S. withdrawal, raising profound questions about the limits of American power. The final years of the Cold War saw shifts in strategic balance. Arms control agreements and détente reduced tensions, while the Soviet economy stagnated. Reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s, combined with political and economic pressure, weakened the foundations of the socialist bloc. In 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized irreversible collapse. In 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved, ending nearly half a century of Cold War. The United States emerged as the sole remaining superpower in a world no longer divided by two opposing poles. Yet this victory did not signify the end of conflict, but the beginning of a new era of uncertainty, in which questions about the role, responsibility, and limits of American power became more urgent than ever. The modern era, 1991 present. With the end of the Cold War in 1991, the United States entered the modern era with a position unprecedented in history, a lone superpower without a comparable rival. Carrying the belief that the liberal democratic market order it represented had decisively triumphed. Many observers called this moment the unipolar moment, when American military, economic, and cultural power spread across the globe. Yet within this confidence, new sources of instability were already forming. The 1990s witnessed accelerating globalization. Multinational corporations, information technology, and free trade reshaped the U.S. economy. The internet evolved from a military project into civilian infrastructure, transforming communication, work, and access to knowledge. Stock markets surged, and the United States experienced relatively stable economic growth. At the same time, manufacturing shifted overseas, weakening many traditional industrial communities and intensifying regional and social inequality. September 11, 2001 became a seismic turning point. Terrorist attacks on New York and Washington killed thousands and fundamentally altered how the United States viewed security and its global role. The War on Terror was launched, with military campaigns in Afghanistan and later Iraq, initiating two prolonged and costly wars that generated deep domestic and international controversy. Executive power expanded, surveillance increased, and fear became a persistent element of public life. As wars continued abroad, the United States faced another internal shock, the financial crisis of 2008. Originating in the housing market and financial system, it spread globally and plunged the U.S. economy into severe recession. Millions lost jobs and homes, and trust in financial and political institutions eroded. The government intervened on a massive scale to rescue banks and stimulate the economy, igniting fierce debate over responsibility and fairness. The 2010s were marked by deepening social and political polarization. Debates over immigration, racial inequality, civil rights, and the role of government intensified both online and offline. Social media connected people while simultaneously fragmenting discourse. As information spread rapidly but truth became increasingly fragile, movements such as Black Lives Matter reflected unresolved historical wounds, while populism challenged traditional political norms. The COVID-19 pandemic beginning in 2020 exposed both the strengths and weaknesses of American society. Scientific and technological capacity enabled rapid vaccine development, yet political division and social inequality made the national response uneven. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, and lasting economic and social impacts reshaped work, education, and perceptions of the state's role. Internationally, the United States entered a new era of strategic competition with the rise of China. The renewed ambitions of Russia, and global challenges such as climate change, cybersecurity, and non-traditional terrorism, American global leadership was no longer taken for granted, increasingly questioned from both abroad and within. The modern era, therefore, is not a story of absolute victory, but of continual self-examination. The United States remains the most influential nation in the world, yet is also a society grappling with internal contradictions over identity, justice, and the future. From 1991 to the present, American history continues to be written not as a straight line of progress, but as a series of choices, each leaving long-lasting consequences. And with the central question still unresolved, what will America become in the 21st century? When power is no longer the privilege of a single nation,